Here's a by necessity grainy image of Monty Python's famous fish slapping skit, and here's kind of a modern recreation by a YouTube channel called The Bell Life. And those both make for a pretty unique way to start one of my SAP videos, right? But here's why. This is The Whopper by Andrew T. Price, and he came up with a pretty unique design for an impact weapon. What a great idea. It's really fun and actually quite functional, as you'll see. This is 13 ounces. It's soft loaded. And definitely a conversation piece, that is for sure. He makes these in two sizes. The Whopper's 13 ounces, the Tiddler is 9. This thing here is a load. Now, looking at this profile, you'll see what's unique about this, fairly unique. As a sap itself, notice how thin the handling portion is, right? Versus the load. Now, that often exists to a certain degree, but not to this extreme. So you get a very floppy, very appropriate, right? Very floppy, top-heavy weapon. And you really have to check it out this way, right? In a profile to notice how stark that is. So just a great idea, and we'll get into more of the design features here in a second and give you some more looks. It's kind of interesting from a history standpoint, history of these weapons, since as I trace out in my book, sailor weapons played such a prominent role in the development of this kind of impact weapon. It's nice to have one that calls back to the sea, right? Andrew was telling me he just kind of hit upon the idea that the fish outline might make a good one. You get the narrow grip, right? Kind of, you can see it slim down, but then the tail flares out. There's the tail. So that helps with retention. And of course, like we talked about before, it makes for a real floppy, top-heavy weapon. I actually have two of these, so I'm going to do an impact test type video with my other one, but first let's just check this thing out and give it a proper review as it deserves. The leather work is really well done. It feels very solid, especially because it's a hefty sap, so you need that stitching to be strong to keep all of that load in place, and he does a lot of nice fun little flourishes, as you can see throughout. Here's the other one, but like I said, we'll get to it in detail in a future video. So you can see it goes for kind of a different color scheme. He doesn't do just one design. Now you might have noticed this thing has a very thick, sturdy strap, and that's a good idea because the handle is so thin, right, by design it's so thin that even with the fish tail shape to help retention, you want extra help in that regard. So that's a good idea. This thing will not slip out of your hand. So insert joke about, fish being slippery, that kind of thing. There's all kinds of bad jokes you can make here, If you hit somebody with this, they'll end up with a splitting haddock. The load here is really tightly packed. There's just not a lot of give at all. Remember that a quote-unquote soft sap means the inside is something that's looser than, one solid piece of metal. So metal shot in this case, sand, etc. Speaking of that, to a certain extent, here's a reproduction Gonzalez 415, which is also tightly packed metal shot. And in terms of like the history of these weapons, notice the outline there, it's a little bit similar, right? Except that the shaft is so thick, where here it's not at all. So you get a very different feel. But I'm kind of looking for examples to compare this to. Here's a vintage Buckheimer Texan, and it, along with the 415, show that the Whopper definitely counts as a large sap. Now look how thin that profile is, how uniform. Really, really different. So hard to find an analog exactly to the profile of this one here. In terms of famous modern big saps, if anything, this is more like the Victorian era and even Georgian era leather saps. So where it's all about the swing, right? You would not do an edge strike, you wouldn't do a butt-end strike, you wouldn't do a thrust. This is all about the swinging, slapping motion. You can see there how the load just naturally bends down, right? Just from gravity alone. So again, a lot of flexibility in that handle, which means a lot of velocity in the swing. So there's the combination retention system, right? The fish fins, I guess you'd say, and the loop. And then, just because, I'm the historian of these weapons, I have to point out also there's a fun little tangent that I don't think was on Andrew's mind when he first made these, which is that fish whacker is one of the names for a sap, and that's because things like them were used to, knock out a fish once you hauled it in. And as you can see here, you can just Google fish whacker and you get all kinds of options. And as I point out in my book, the lines were really blurry, right? Something you carry to finish off a fish could also be what you use in the tavern later. Or you could get an item that's ostensibly for dispatching fish or game, but you're really carrying it around for personal protection. So it's got this real rustic look, which I love, and kind of etymological callback to things like this. I haven't broken this one out in a long time. Definitely the rarest piece of my collection, that loaded bamboo kosh. And someone commented, oh, that was for fish, that wasn't a weapon. I think somebody said the same thing about this one here, but again, actually the lines were just much blurrier than that. So you can see how our fish whacker here, the Whopper, has some interesting tiebacks to the history of our subject. It's the first fish whacker that's a fish whacker. And as mentioned previously, it does whack hard. This thing packs a wallop. So really fun design, and like I said, I'll have a follow-up video at some point.